So I just wanted to thank you all that are on the line right now, and joining us tonight is Mark Ermentrout from the Department of Public Instruction, and he's going to talk to us about dropouts and how maybe we can best avoid and do a better job so that we have students that are hanging in there and um, not dropping out of school. So um, I'll be sending out Mark's slides after this call for those that are here, and then for those that are not able to join us right at the moment. So Mark, thank you again for, oh shoot, there goes my camera. Um, I'm on a PC instead of a laptop, so it's a little different. Thanks for joining us, and I'm so happy that you're going to talk to us. Tonight we had more providers that registered than parents, but that's really a good thing too. So I'm just going to let you go ahead and take it away, and I'm going to make you a co-host here. Hang on. There you go. Okay, you should be able to share your screen if you're able.
Give it a go here. Okay. Are you seeing it there?
Yep.
Okay. Deneen, I just want to say thank you for allowing me to be here tonight. I'd like to thank each person who's here for the work that you do, for the services as a provider, as a family member, whatever your role might be. So as Deneen said, my name is Mark Ermentrout. I'm a special education regional coordinator at the Department of Public Instruction. I've been with the department for a little over a year and a half now. And some of my main portfolios at the department include graduation and dropout rates for students with disabilities. I coordinate the dispute resolution for special education in North Dakota. And then I also coordinate the state systemic improvement plan. And for the state systemic improvement plan, we have a goal. North Dakota stakeholders have set a goal of improving graduation rates for students who are identified as having an emotional disturbance. It's 6-year graduation rates. I'll talk a little bit more about some of that as we go along. But again, I just wanted to thank you for the time and just that it's a privilege to be here tonight. I will go and I will just chug along, but please feel free to interrupt or ask questions, make comments. We can wrestle with some of this together if there are ideas that we want to discuss further. So a quick overview. I'll just touch on some background information, talk a fair amount about the closing the achievement gap is kind of how I think about things oftentimes, and we'll share some statistics. We'll explore a few reasons why students drop out of high school, and hopefully woven throughout, and especially as we go along, there'll be more and more specifics about exactly what we can do about it. So I thought I would begin early on just sharing. Is this still a logo that you use, Deneen?
It is. Yeah.
Okay. I thought it was fantastic. And when I looked at your bullet points on the right side of that, I see family-centered care. I see partnerships. I see things that sound like community wraparound supports, strong, informed families and communities, self-advocacy, and empowerment. And when we start looking at some specific strategies that align with dropout prevention, these are bullet points that just a great example about how our partnerships, we are better together than just trying to do it alone. So I would just invite you to keep those principles in mind as we keep going. So I was actually on a call today talking about parent engagement and meaningful parent engagement. Uh, and just that always great reminder, parents' love for their children is the single greatest and the most underutilized natural resource in education. When we get to actually some of the effectiveness strategies, um, this slide will just scream out because the reality is meaningful family engagement in improving graduation rates, preventing dropout is meaningful. Meaningful family engagement is the second most effective strategy that we have. So just a quick overview. When we're thinking about dropping out as a process, a student doesn't show up, in the spring of their senior year one day and all of a sudden make the decision. They woke up that morning and said, I think I'm going to go into school and drop out. I've just had enough. There are things that happen along the way, and we can go all the way back to early childhood even and see students beginning to stray off the path towards graduation or continuing on being supported and growing along that path towards graduation. So when I look at our pre-K through grade 12 education strategic framework in the state, our vision is that all students will graduate choice ready. Choice ready meaning they're ready for post-secondary education, or they'll graduate ready for the workforce and or ready for the military. And the strategic initiatives, so focusing on students entering kindergarten ready to learn, focusing on students being reading by the time they're in third grade. We know that if students aren't reading by the time they're in third grade, they begin to stray off the path towards graduation. So all of these bullet points align with that idea that um, graduation isn't something that just happens your senior year, but also dropping out isn't either. Um, so on the left side, that strategic framework are those bullet points that was just on the screen. In North Dakota, on the right side, you see the high school accountability that all schools and high school students are basically, schools are evaluated based on their graduation rates, whether their students are graduating choice ready, whether students are completing school. That little chart below that is the choice ready framework. You may have seen this, maybe you haven't. But again, that talks about essential skills for students that they'll have when they graduate from high school. And then it talks about those three areas. Being choice ready means you're ready for post-secondary education, you're ready for the workforce, and or ready for the military. And then in the middle, and I'll come back to that later, is the reality is we know what to do to support students moving towards graduation. The National Dropout Prevention Center, for example, has 15 effective strategies that have more than 30 years of research that has gone into that show. Well, each of these strategies, these 15 strategies, I don't know if you can see my mouse on the screen or not, but these strategies can be implemented individually, but they're most effective if they're implemented together. Just for example, under foundational strategies, you see school community collaboration. And if we have good school community collaboration, that means we are partnering with our families. That means we might have more access to literacy development. Sometimes we hear schools say, we just can't find mentors. because we know mentors can be very effective, or tutors. But if we have good school community partnerships, we're more likely to have access to community partners who want to serve and work together, mentoring and tutoring. It comes down to career and tech. It comes down to students having job experiences, work experiences in the community. So it's just kind of an example how there's overlap and they feed off each other. But before I go any further, I thought maybe you've seen this data, maybe you haven't. Every December 1st in every state in the nation, states are required to get a count of the number of students identified with disabilities in the state, in in the schools that year. So as of December 1st, 2020, there were 16,486 students identified as having an Individuals with Disabilities Education Act disability. That's ages 3 to 21 in North Dakota. So that's over 14% of North Dakota students. You can see graduation rates by disability subgroups in North Dakota. So at the top is our students identified as having a specific learning disability. The gray or silver line there are students identified as having an intellectual disability. So there's a discrepancy there. Most subgroups are making progress. The students identified as having a specific learning disability has actually fallen off a little bit in the past couple of years. So when I talk about closing the achievement gap, we often think about the achievement gap between students with and without disabilities, and we're thinking about reading, English language arts, math, the academic areas. But I would also propose that we have achievement gaps in graduation rates, and the data clearly points that out. So this blue line at the top is since 2012, 2013 to the present. This is all students in North Dakota. And we often hear, North Dakota actually has very good graduation rates across the nation compared to other states across the nation. So our overall graduation rate last year was 88.45% of students who were eligible to graduated. The red line is students with disabilities. The green line here is just, for example, students identified as having an emotional disturbance. So you can see over the past 3 years, we had a trend line that was going up as far as graduation rates. We're making good progress. Last year, things plateaued a little bit. So I don't know, I guess I'll throw it out to you. Do you have thoughts or hypotheses? I mean, one of the big things that we're wrestling with, and we are trying to be really intentional about working with our partners and visiting with our partners, we're concerned about the impact that COVID and the changing in school structures is potentially having on students, and especially students with disabilities across the state. We hypothesize that there's potential there that when things shut down in March, or when in-person learning stopped, that some students may have drifted away that would have otherwise graduated.
Excuse me, Mark,
No,
this is
go ahead.
Gail.
Yeah.
And what I'm seeing and working with kids, I see once the school system shut down in March, the kids checked out, because I heard the kids talking about, well, yeah, we have to go online, but they're not even really grading it anyway. If we were doing okay, they're going to still pass us. And a lot of this you would, I mean, expect it from the older kids, but it was reaching down even to the grade school kids, and talking to kids. So I think with COVID and doing the distant learning, it has dramatically impacted how our kids are viewing school.
Yeah, thanks for that perspective, Gail. You know, we're wrestling with that as far as my sense is, as a state, we've gotten a lot better since a year ago at this time, but we still have a lot to learn. I mean, we're also talking a lot with the legislature right now about accelerating learning recovery plans. We're getting a lot of questions and having a lot of discussion there. Not, there are things that we can do, but I hear what you're saying, Gail, and that there are concerns for sure.
Significant concerns in my world.
I work with populations of students who social emotional learning needs, and there's certain pockets within that group that have really engaged in a virtual environment, but probably more than that, there are students who we're concerned have faded a little bit.
Mark, this is Kathy. I was just wondering, I mean, what I see here on your screen is just that it's really systematically across the whole system, all schools. These are just average, numbers to make a difference that impacts all those different schools, all those different families, all those different situations. Do we have schools where there's, a number of students with ED who maybe things weren't looking so good for them, and it got turned around, and they are increasing the graduation rates in those schools? Do we have some schools that are maybe doing well, that are doing it right? And can we take that and apply it in other schools? Sometimes it's hard to know as an individual teacher or parent, if any administrator, if anything you're going to do is going to make a difference. If that student's going to drop out, they're going to drop out. I hear that. So, but there are things that make a difference. Are there some schools that have done really well?
Right, and there are, I'm trying to think what the term, there are pockets of bright pockets across the state being shared. There has also been a lot of creativity and engagement, re-engagement in different ways. The other thing that I would put out there, for example, some of our students who experience a fair amount of anxiety, as far as social anxiety and things like that, some of them have been more engaged through a virtual environment. Some of them have maybe been impacted because it's a change that's been hard. So
I know there was a school I talked to in Fargo a couple of years ago, and they had some special programs for their Native American students who they felt were more likely to drop out. And one of the more successful programs that they had, although they had trouble getting consistent funding for it, was a Check and Connect program, where just some meaningful adult in that student's life every day stopped and said, "How's it going? How you doing?" Had made a real difference for those students. And I wonder if we have that kind of Check and Connect going with the virtual situation.
yeah, it's so we have, as a department, we offer discretionary funding proposals across the state to special education units, community partners that want to apply for those. And we actually have, I believe it's 3 special education units right now who have a discretionary grant for Check and Connect specifically.
Mhm.
And one of the REAs in the state is supporting Check and Connect. This kind of goes back to that 15 strategies and the mentoring.
Mhm.
It's that daily check-in.
It's
So
evidence-based, right? I mean, it's been proven to work.
it's one of the clearest, most effective ways of engaging students and re-engaging, keeping them engaged. That's right. Yeah. So for dropping out, we've had progress. You can see the orange line is over the past 3 years. The orange line is students identified as having an emotional disturbance. While we've made progress there, it still crushes me to think 1 out of 3 students identified as having an emotional disturbance drops out. You know, in 2016-17, it was almost 50%. You could almost flip a coin and predict whether a student was going to drop out or not. I mean, your chances. So we've made progress there, but there's still a long way to go. The other thing that intrigues me, and I want to use that word cautiously, but our second highest group as far as students with disabilities who drop out of school are students identified as having a speech language impairment. And, you know, there's a number of hypotheses around that, but there are opportunities, I think, for us to make progress in these areas. So
Mark,
again,
Mark,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
what is the thought process behind why speech language is a high number?
Yeah, it's a great question. One of the things that we hypothesize, evidence is a little loose, but there's more research being done around it. Students, we're thinking there's an overlap between students who have social emotional learning needs and students with speech language impairments. So, you know, that orange and green line, there could be some overlap. There's also some thinking that by the time, if you're still identified as having a speech language impairment when you get to the high school level, it's probably not a mild speech issue. It's a speech language impairment that is fundamentally impacting you across your courses, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have thoughts, Deneen, or anyone else?
This is Vicki.
Yeah.
I just had a question for you, Mark. Do you think any of it relates to the fact that we have a shortage of speech language pathologists in the state?
That's a great question. What do you think?
Well, I do think that. I mean, I work with all kinds of families, of course, across the whole state, mostly here in Western North Dakota. But I mean, I even think of the rural areas where you're only getting a speech path in there, maybe luckily 1-2 days a week. I mean, I talked to
That
some
would be a
schools.
lot.
I talked to some schools that say if I can get even a day a week, that's great. So I think, so I do believe, I think that then, it just keeps going on year after year. And then, not saying that the schools don't want to help, but, that's why we have speech pathologists, that's their specialist. And, so I've actually heard it from some students that I've worked from and their parents that have had just that lack of speech in their school. And again, it's not always due to the school not really trying. It's just we don't have the staff. There's a
Yeah.
huge shortage.
Yeah, that's a, thank you for sharing that, Vicky. I made a note of that as we continue to wrestle with this, and there's a lot of potential implications there. So this is kind of that same graduation rate closing the achievement gap, except for dropout rates, and the silver line then is students identified as having an ED. The orange line is students with disabilities, and the blue line is all students in North Dakota. So here we want the numbers going lower. I don't know if you're interested, educational environment, number of children with IEPs 6 through 21. You can see the blue area in the regular class, 80% or more of the day. The orange, less than 40%, and then the silver or gray, separate schools, residential facilities. Our students identified as speech impaired are in the class the most. Our students identified as having an intellectual disability the least.
That's an interesting graph.
Mhm.
Exactly.
Yeah. And then one more just on post-school outcomes for students with disabilities. So if you take a pie 100%, you can see that students with disabilities, 29% enrolled in higher education, 33% competitive employment, post-secondary education or training, almost 8%, some other type of employment, 11%. And it to me, it's always concerning when we see 18% of our students who have left school, students with disabilities, aren't in any of those other 4 categories. Is that a fair question or concern?
Yeah, it is a concern. I don't remember of the 15 strategies, but it does make me wonder as we have to have a transition plan in place for students with disabilities by their 16th birthday, which means
Right.
you really have to start when they're at least 15. So you have it in place by the time they're 16. You can't start, a week before their 16th birthday and expect to have a very good plan. And I'm wondering as we train teachers and families how to do transition, if there maybe are some things we could focus on related to staying in school and graduating for these different subgroups of students that should be built into their plan.
And
whether it's mentoring or whatever.
I think that's I wonder if you're maybe going to hear some themes, depending on how far we get tonight, that touches to that, Kathy.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I said I coordinate the state systemic improvement plan for North Dakota. It's been in place for 8 years now in the state. Our SIMR, our state identified measurable result, was determined by our IDEA advisory group. It's a diverse group of stakeholders from North Dakota. So again, our focus on that is improving 6-year graduation rates for students identified as having ED. But the reality is, if we are intentional about the evidence-based practices, creating the infrastructure and scaling up these efforts, it should have positive effects on students identified as having ED. It should have positive effects on all students with disabilities. And the reality is, if we're creating the systems and structures, it has the potential to impact all students. So why do students drop out? This is North Dakota students said this just in some of the, after they've graduated from the year out survey, asking what they're doing now and about their school experience. So students reported, missing too many days. They got too far behind and just were overwhelmed. Thought it might be easier to get their GED, got behind in their courses or grades, or were failing. They didn't like school. They couldn't keep up with school. If a student gets pregnant, they begin to stray off the path. It's an indicator that we want to support to keep them re-engaged on the graduation pathway. If a student goes to work beyond, an after-school job or something like that, not getting along, don't feel like they belong at school. We know that if a student is a part of a small group, whether it's athletics, whether it's music, whether it's a cultural heritage club, whatever it might be, if they're part of a small group at school, they're more likely to graduate.
Mark,
So,
I was just going to mention today there was a hearing in the Senate Human Services Committee where a young woman from Midco, I think, talked about how she was bullied, and because of that, she had attempted a suicide several times, but she said at one point where she wanted to drop out because of the bullying that had gone on.
so it's thanks for sharing that, Deneen, and that's a great point as far as, we're talking about dropping out being a process, and that a student doesn't just show up and say, things have been going okay, but today I'm going to drop out.
Right.
They don't just make that decision. But if they're beginning to stray off the path towards graduation, there can be one defining event that makes them make that decision. So if they're straying off the path towards graduation a little bit, and there's a bullying incident, or maybe it's a suspension or whatever it might be in that adolescent's mind, that could be a trigger that causes dropping out, make a decision to drop out. Yeah. But that example you shared, Deneen, there's so many levels of concern in there, isn't there?
Sure.
So with the state systemic improvement plan this year, we're focusing on 5 things, and I'm not sure if I should just start going fast, or I appreciate the dialogue. We're probably not going to get through them all. I may touch on them, but we know that if we focus our efforts, we can move the needle. We can make a difference. For example, our students who identify as Native American in North Dakota, over the past 5 to 7 years, our conscious efforts have been made to improve graduation rates for students who are Native American. And Native American students have gone from a graduation rate in North Dakota of 55% up to 72%. Still a long way to go, but that's pretty significant gains. Did somebody say something?
I'm just murmuring in agreement. Keep going.
Okay. So, I know everybody is here with students in mind. I can picture little ones over my life. I can picture high schoolers, students with health needs, students with social emotional needs, students. I can picture students with speech language impairments at the high school level. But one, you know, we're probably familiar with the proverb, give me a fish and I eat for a day, teach me to fish and I eat for a lifetime. And then sometimes students who get labeled, and I'm going to use air quotes, as not motivated, say, you know, I don't know how to fish. I don't really care to learn. I don't even like fish. So don't bother me. And then we see a student who might be feeling like that, and their progress is just all over the place. So if we're not intentional, you know, we might be saying or doing things that are supporting them straying off the path towards graduation instead of towards the path. Richard Lavoie makes the crystal clear point that the reality is that students aren't unmotivated. They just might not be motivated by what we are particularly asking them to do. And so if we engage students in their hopes and dreams, and if we help provide the means so that they can achieve willpower and way power, that same sporadic achievement all of a sudden becomes consistent performance over time. So one of the things during 2021 really have been promoting anywhere and however, wherever I can, that dropping out isn't a process, not an event. What I was going to focus on for next year, but I couldn't wait, I have to get it out, is the reality is that all students have hopes and dreams. So our reality as educators, as community providers, as family support professionals, as parents, is wrestling with that idea. How do we leverage this individual person's hopes and dreams to help them continue to move forward? And in the educational environment towards graduating choice ready for post-secondary, workforce, or military. You know, we talk about it looks like a cartoon at first glance, but we see the student basically being kicked out of school, saying, you know, we can't afford to save this one, but don't worry, someone will catch him. And the reality is, we know that somebody will catch him. Everybody wants to belong to a small group of some kind. The evidence is clear that when a student gets kicked out of school or drops out of school, they're more likely to be involved with the judicial system, the social service system, and the healthcare system. Some people are interested in the financial side. The reality is, for every student who drops out of school, these are individual people. But over the course of that individual's lifetime, it has a $300,000 to a $500,000 impact on the community. Those numbers are staggering to me. So if we just take 1% of not the 1920 school year's graduation cohort of about 7,600 students, 1% is 76 students, an average of $400,000. That's a, conservatively speaking, that's a $25 million impact over these students' lifetime. And the way that that has been measured, I mean, and it's been measured multiple times, if a student drops out of high school, they're more likely to have a reduced earning power. They're more likely to spend less on boats and homes and rec leisure type options. And they're more likely to be interacting with our community service system, whether it's social services, judicial services, health services. Keeping in mind that our 4-year graduation rate in North Dakota is 88%.
That is pretty staggering.
Yeah. So I'm going to, you know, we're talking a lot across the department and wanting to, across the state, just again, we're all in this together, and we are better when we are together. Whether they're public-private partnerships, public-public partnerships, how do we align our time, our effort, our funding, our messaging, whatever it might be, families, agencies, schools, all stakeholders, to maximize our effectiveness. During the pandemic, at least in our department, we're talking a lot with schools and family support organizations about these 5 principles. The reality is communication. When communication and relationships, as soon as trust begins to break down, relationships get strained, communication gets impacted. And the reality is, during the pandemic, it was harder to have just to be walking down the hall, having those informal conversations that we used to take for granted, for example. We talk about good faith efforts, individualizing, and we talk from a special education standpoint, using a prior written notice, because that's a communication tool to make sure family and school are understanding what was decided in the same way. The other thing I wanted to share, and we might originally think this is for the schools, but I'm also going to say it's for all of us, no matter what our role is. The reality is there are early warning systems that show when a student is beginning to stray off the path towards graduation. These early warning systems, they're indicators, they're symptoms, they're not causes. So it's kind of like if you go into the doctor and you get your temperature taken. If you've got a fever, it doesn't diagnose what's wrong, but it says, you know, we got to do some further work, or we have to figure out how to intervene to support getting back to health. Early warning systems are indicators that show when a student is likely straying off the path towards graduation. So attendance, behavior, and course completion. And we could talk about these for hours in itself. So if a student misses 20 days of school over the course of the school year, they are likely straying off the path towards graduation. That's 10% of school. And if you're missing 10% of school, instruction could be being impacted. Sometimes somebody might say, well, you know, 2 days a month isn't that much. But the reality is 2 days a month adds up to 18 to 20 days in and of itself. That could almost go unnoticed if it's not someone who's vocal or disruptive.
So Mark,
Yeah,
this is Vicky again. So when I look at these indicator and warning systems, I definitely work with families where I see this continuously.
yeah.
But when we're talking about this, I've seen a rise in schools that families, and you know, we've tried to have meetings and stuff to talk about the attendance, especially the attendance during COVID here. And it seems like I'm seeing more and more the first recourse is to call Child Protective Services. And I'm finding that that is not working very well. In fact, it's in a couple of my cases, it's made the student miss even more days and not getting much help for the family and not really digging, I shouldn't say digging, not really communicating enough to know what's behind why we're not attending school.
Right.
You know, and so I just want to mention that because it has become more concerning for me actually in the last couple of years, but really heightened over the pandemic.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I was making a note here as you were talking, because I want to want to explore that a little bit more, as far as in some of the conversations I have in the next week or two.
I think one thing that goes along with that is once a student starts missing some school like that, and maybe they've had some behavioral incidences, maybe they're not doing well in some of their classes. You know, I think a lot of times our schools, our teachers feel like sort of helpless because they don't really know how to fix this kid. So they go from there to either blaming the kid or blaming their family, especially in our small towns where there's a lot of talk about everybody knows who these kids are and who their families are. And I could have told you years ago this was going to happen. And so it gets to be almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy for some of those kids. And so as we work on messaging, I think we need to I really agree with you that we need to message that whole town, and we can't just, you know, none of that really changes those patterns, as Vicki said, of absenteeism. It makes it worse.
Yeah, no, it's point well taken. Two things that I want to touch on, if I may. Back to the Child Protective Services. There was actually, just because we were also concerned about hearing some of those things back in the fall, that referrals like that were really a lot higher, and there were questions on whether it was appropriate. So there was some communication put out to schools in North Dakota, clarifying some things. I haven't heard that as much recently, so I'm glad that you said something, Vicki. And like I said, I want to follow up in a couple conversations that I'm having this
Right.
week.
And I don't mean to judge just because a school automatically calls Child Protective Services. Yep. I agree with Kathy. It's our messaging, and they don't have tools either.
Right.
And you know, for as many schools as I've dealt with, I mean, there's not any of them that really, you know, just say, well, yeah, of course we're going to call Child Protective Services. I think they're, you know, they don't know who to reach out to, and they don't always know, you know, what other supports outside of that school system could help, and make a difference there. And like I said, if it's an automatically you're punishing a student, you know, I've seen the increase. Well, and I'll talk to the family as well. Have they been to school this week? No. Last week they went 3 days. This week they're going no days. You know, pushing that far out. And surprisingly for me, Mark, I see this more in the middle school area. So that's always a really high concern when I see things like that happening in middle school.
So
scary.
Yeah, you know, and we know that middle school, that we know that if a student fails English in 6th grade, their chances of graduating go way. I mean, it's staggering, and unless we intervene, the transition from middle school to high school, the first 10 days attendance, the first 10 days of high school are huge predictors on whether a student graduates or not. That transition to high school, a student can have a terrible, however you define that, school career before that. But if they transition to high school somewhat successfully, their likelihood of graduation goes way up. The early warning systems, the hope is, and we're piloting right now with the American Institute of Research in 3 high schools in North Dakota, is to begin to get at some of the things that are being described here, as far as schools are already collecting this data, and to help support them in using that data to make intentional decisions, not how to, you know, punish them for lack of attendance or whatever, but how do we then look at, okay, what's happening so the student's not in school? and how do we intervene? So develop their toolboxes to support them, whether it's attendance-wise, behavior-wise. We're not even going to be able to talk about the course performance when we're getting into transition IEPs and the hopes and dreams and transition. I mean, all of those aspects. So the reality of the early warning systems is we want to identify students who are at risk of dropping out. We want to match interventions that match the interventions that are appropriate for the student, that are going to help support them getting back on track. And then we want to progress monitor. We want to see if what we're doing is helping. And if it's not, we need to tweak it or make some changes to get them going. Deneen, I'm watching the time, and you tell me when you want me to stop. But I'll quit by 9 at least.
Janine, you're muted.
Yeah,
there.
I'm on mute. You go ahead and keep going, Mark. I think there's enough interest to hear it. So
So do you remember that slide that I showed? Why do students drop out? The missing too many days, think it's easier to get poor grades, failing school. Look at how that aligns with the early warning systems. Missing too many days is attendance, poor grades, failing school, course performance, don't like school. That could be a behavior. The other thing that I just want to mention is the reality is the literature is clear that students who drop out say school wasn't relevant to me, I didn't have a primary relationship, check and connect, or the rigor wasn't there. And sometimes we say, well, maybe it's too hard and they're acting out, but sometimes maybe it's too easy. So it's figuring out and balancing that. The other thing, and these are small, I was going to talk about both of these separately. On the right hand of your screen, you see the 15 practices from the National Dropout Prevention Center. On the left side of your screen, I'll go to another. Maybe that's a little bigger. These are 23 predictors from the National Technical Assistance Center on Transition. They break it up into columns: education, employment, independent living, and they talk about these practices, that have positive outcomes, and think about family voices and your bullet points, your priorities, and look at where they fit in here. Everything from autonomy, decision-making, to independent living, to self-advocacy, self-determination. I mean, parental involvement, we just keep going on and on. The other thing I wanted to show you was, this is one of the slides I was talking about earlier. When we look at the correlational research, with a 1.0 being a perfect correlation, that's huge to get a 1.0. Anything over a 0.7 is a strong correlation. A 0.3 is still a positive correlation, but not near as strong. The most effective predictor of if a student is going to graduate from high school is if they've taken 2 consecutive CTE classes in an area of interest to them. I mean, think about relevance, relationships, and rigor. The second most is meaningful family engagement. And then the third, mentoring, the check and connect, for example. If there's anything you want to, I mean, there's check and connect right there. Self-advocacy, self-determination, self-directed IEPs. I'm preaching to the choir here in many ways.
You are, but preach away. We love
Preach on. Okay. I'll just wrap things up, and and I use this often with educators, but I also use it with a variety of people. Replace whatever your role is in here, because the reality is we are each, this can apply to each of us. So Haim-Ginot writes, I've come to the frightening conclusion that I am a decisive element, that my personal approach can create a climate that makes a difference. My daily mood can make the weather. As a teacher, as a parent, as a family advocate, whatever my role is, I possess tremendous power in a child's life to make it miserable or joyous. Or whatever my role, I can be a tool of torture or an instrument of inspiration. I can humiliate or humor, hurt or heal. In all situations, my response can decide if a crisis is going to be escalated or de-escalated, a child humanized or dehumanized. I want to thank you for allowing me some time tonight. I want to thank Deneen for her leadership in the state, and thank each of you for your dedication, for the difference you make for students with disabilities, for all students in North Dakota.
Well, Mark, thank you. This was wonderful. And one question that comes to mind, only because Vicki and I were listening to the hearing on early childhood. They're having a lot of discussions on early childhood, and Representative Weiss had a former representative from Utah that provided some information on a curriculum that they use for early childhood.
Okay.
And I can't help but wonder, I mean, he talked about how this program that they have implemented in Utah has really decreased the dropout rates as the kids get older, because if they're ready as they're going into school, that's just going to follow them no matter their culture or their economic environment. Anyway, Vicki, listen to that early child. Listen, if you have, I'll send it to you. But go listen to his discussion, because he really kind of laid it out to the legislators you really need to look at this. And he kind of slapped them in the head, really, without them realizing that they had been smacked in the head, like, you guys are not fulfilling your promises to your kids.
Wow.
So it was pretty, wasn't it, Vicki? It was really impactful.
Yeah, I have advised so many people to go listen to that, and the comments that are coming back are like, thank goodness you sent me in that direction. I mean, he really put a light into things, and yeah, there was a lot. It's just so hard to describe because it's not something we're used to in our legislative sessions. I just don't, for as many years as I've been doing it, this was just like a breath of fresh air in some ways. Yeah, I would advise everybody to go listen to it.
It was wow, he's speaking our language.
Yeah.
I have heard, I did hear about that afterwards, as far as the gentleman from Utah. So yeah, I would love to see that link. The other thing that I would just put or say along those lines is, one of those foundational strategies in those 15 effective strategies is early childhood education.
Mm-hmm.
Just to what you're saying. I mean, if little ones enter school ready to learn, they're more likely to stay on the path.
Yeah. Yeah. Do we have any data about, because sometimes I feel like the families that are culturally diverse really sometimes feel like they've been discriminated against a little bit too. So I was just wondering if we had any data that looks at some cultural differences too.
We do. Students with disabilities, for example, in North Dakota, students who are white or Asian American, have higher graduation rates. Students who are identify as African American have our lowest graduation rates.
I guess I thought it used to be Native American had the lowest, but now it's African American.
Yeah,
Oh, that's sad. I mean, it's sad for Native too, but it's just sad.
right. And this is, I'm not positive on this, but I'm thinking our Pacific Islanders don't have great graduation rates either.
Mm.
We do have actually some slides broken out like that. Emmanuel in our office can pull together that information. Oh, that's a great comment, Daniel. No one should win the race to the bottom. That's exactly right.
Right, yeah.
We always love having you on, Daniel, because Daniel, you always have those good ones.
We're really working, and it's taken some time, but to really identify, see if there are areas where we can really invest some time and energy and focus to begin to move the needle some more.
Yeah,
Because we know when we focus on it, we can make a difference.
sure. Gail or Heidi, Dan, Lori, Mrs. Eiler, any comments from you all? No? Joan? They're also, Heidi, I see you smiling, but you're so quiet. Well, Mark, I'm anxious to go through the slides now to see, just to let it sink into my brain a little bit. This was really good. Thank you. And we'll
Awesome.
put the recording up and get the slides out to those who registered. So we'll put it up on the website too, so you can direct folks there to watch as well.
Okay. Well, again, just thank you for the time and thank you.
So if there's anything else, Mark, that the department would like to get out to folks, or if there's another topic that you want to cover, just let me know and we're happy to do that. We'll probably end the extended learning calls probably in April, because once that weather gets nice out, people don't want to be on Zoom. So we'll probably do that. So sometime between now and April, if there's something that you want to, and then we'll start them up again in the fall. So.
Okay, it's a good night to be Zooming, isn't it?
Yeah, man, it's
That
cold
is.
out.
Thank you for sharing. I really like your message that it's a process, not an event. That title really drew me in tonight to attend this, so thank you.
Yeah,
Thanks for
thanks,
being here.
Mark. Yeah, it was very good information. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mark, I guess I do have a question. I was on the call the other night about Bills 1416 and 1466. Are there any other departmental pushes towards early education, since you just highlighted that in this biennium, or?
Yeah, those are definitely getting the attention and a lot of energy. I'm trying to think. We're having discussion with the legislature right now about learning recovery. There's some early learning components that may come out of that, but those are the two main ones. You know, as far as autism waiver, I mean, that could affect some little one. Did that just not pass?
It passed. They cut it down to 300,000 per, well, for the biennium.
For the voucher.
Okay.
Yeah,
For the voucher. Okay.
Yeah, it was for the voucher.
Okay.
And then they're going to ask for a study.
All right. All right.
Well, there's the possibility to ask for an amendment on the Senate side, and
Yep.
considering that most of the developments on the House side took place late in the development process, maybe that's something to spare some thought for over the next 6 weeks.
Mhm. Yeah,
Yeah, no, Daniel, to your question, I'm not, there hasn't been anything getting as much conversation anyway as those two bills in our early learning office.
that's kind of exciting though, really, that it's picking up speed. Yeah.
There are opinions all over the place, as you
Yeah.
can imagine on that.
I can.
Why is
Well,
it-
because there are some that still think that that's the parent's job, and actually that gentleman from Utah addressed that complete situation. So that's where it was like, wow, kind of knocked me off my feet. So
Do you recall the name of the gentleman that you're referring to, Deneen? Because I don't know that I saw the testimony.
I'll have to look it up, Daniel, but I'll send it to you.
Thank you.
Yep.
Just send it out to all of us.
Yeah, I can.
Thank you.
He was good.
Janine, could you send that information out to everyone, please?
Yeah, I'll put it when I send out the slides that go to all of you. I will put the I'll put his testimony on there too.
Thank you.
Yep. Because I think it's great. I think everybody should hear that. So, does anybody have any other questions or comments for Mark before we end for the night?
I don't, Deneen, but yeah, his name was Senator Howard Stevenson.
Oh.
He was in their Congress from 2018.
Did anybody watch the Human Services, call it deliberations this morning? I was watching Judiciary. I may go back and look at the testimony on 1416 and 1466. Did anybody note anything of particular importance?
I wasn't on that one. I was in the Senate side of Human Services, so I missed it. So I'll have to go back and listen to. I know that Representative Weiss is trying to surely champion some changes in early childhood, and more power to him for sure. Yeah, so that's good. Okay, hearing no other comments, we'll let you go for the night. Stay warm.
Thanks, everyone. Yeah, you too.
We'll see if that's possible.
Okay, good night,
See
everyone.
ya.